how much control do you actually have over your own mind? It's something I think about sometimes, like when I feel like I'm just going through the motions, just reacting, without really thinking. And that's exactly what we're going to be diving into today.
Right. And we've got this fascinating transcript to work with. It's from a YouTube documentary. It's by Philosophical Essence. It's called How Much Control Do We Actually Have Over Our Mind? With No Brubs documentary in parentheses. Mm-hmm. And it really makes you question that feeling we have that we're always in the driver's seat. You know what I mean? In control of our thoughts and actions.
It really does.
Yeah.
And we should be clear up front. Like, this deep dive isn't about just, like handing the answers, but it is about understanding those things that are kind of shaping what's going on in our minds, things that we maybe don't even see. So like our mission today is to really explore how much control we have. What is the extent of our mental control? And also to think about like, what are those things that are influencing us? So, our subconscious, but also things like our environment, society, the media, frequencies, all that stuff. And then ultimately, like, is there anything we can do to actually gain more agency?
Yeah. Yeah. And, there's some really surprising things in here, stuff that'll really make you think. Like, for example, this idea that our brains might actually be making decisions before we're even consciously aware of them. Crazy, right? Yeah. Or how we might be influenced by frequencies that we can't even perceive. It definitely makes you take a closer look at what we think of as a thought or a free.
Totally. Okay, so let's get into it. And the documentary, they start with this idea of free choice, which is a big one, right? And they use this example that I think a lot of people can relate to. Imagine you're at a restaurant, you've got the menu in front of you, and you're like, ooh, that pasta dish looks good. I think I'll have that. But the transcript is saying, like, hang on a sec. The menu itself is kind of guiding your decision. The options they give you, the prices, even those like mouth-watering photos, and then even just like, is it a cold day? Are you craving something warm? It's all subtly influenced.
Yeah, it is. It is. And what I think is so interesting is how that simple restaurant example actually kind of reflects bigger decisions we make in, things like what career path you choose or where you live, who your friends are. We feel like those are such personal choices, right? But the source material, it suggests that those choices are shaped by things we might not even be thinking about. Things like, what did your parents do for work? What's your economic background? What kind of culture did you grow up in? It's like, the path is kind of being laid out for us, even if we think we're the ones choosing it.
It is. And I feel like in this digital age, a really good example of those like invisible influencers is social media. I mean, we think we're just scrolling, right? Clicking whatever catches our eye. But this documentary, it's pointing out that there are these really smart algorithms designed by, experts. And these algorithms are constantly trying to predict what we'll do. What will make us click, what will keep us watching. So that like seemingly free choice to spend hours on, TikTok or whatever, it might not be as free as it feels.
You're right. And it gets even deeper. The transcript even questions the originality of our thoughts themselves, the words we use to frame an idea, even those aha moments. Those are often built on things we've already encountered, ideas and information. Our brains, they're amazing at recognizing patterns and then combining them in new ways. So it feels new to us, but a lot of the time those ingredients are coming from somewhere else.
That's interesting. Okay, well, what about money? Because I feel like we tend to feel like we have a pretty strong sense of control when it comes to our finances, right? Like what we earn, how we spend it. But this transcript is suggesting that actually we're just operating within a system, like using a currency we didn't even invent, which I guess is true. So, it does make you think about how much agency do we really have when it comes to money decisions?
Right. And if we zoom out even further, the documentary uses this really powerful image. It talks about leaves floating down a river. We can make little adjustments, maybe steer slightly this way or that. But those major currents of our lives, those are mostly determined by these bigger forces. So again, it's not saying we have no power at all, but it definitely kind of changes your perspective.
Yeah, it does. Okay. Well, this is where it gets really interesting, I think, because now the source material dives into how predictable we are as humans. And they talk about advertising, right? These huge companies, they spend billions of dollars trying to understand our behavior. And what the transcript points out is that they often see us not as these completely independent thinkers, but as, kind of predictable consumers who respond to certain carefully crafted messaging.
Right. And they highlight this correlation that's often seen between our political views and our parents' political, or our friends, or our social groups, or how, like, the music we like, or the clothes we wear, the entertainment we choose. It often follows these, like, predictable patterns, and it really challenges this idea that, like, we have these super unique and independent tastes and preferences, you know?
It does. And honestly, it's kind of unsettling to think about. But, you know, the documentary also, like, presents this idea that maybe it's actually liberating in a way. Like, if we let go of this idea that we have total control, maybe we can actually be kinder to ourselves, you know?
Yeah.
Things don't go exactly as planned. Because it's not always, like, entirely our fault, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that actually brings up a really good point about how we see success and failure, you know? Because the transcript observes this thing. People who are super successful, they often think it's all because of, you know, their hard work and their smart choices. And sometimes they forget about things like luck, right? Or the fact that they had certain advantages that other people maybe didn't. But then on the other hand, when people experience setbacks, they often internalize it. Like it's a personal failing, you know, instead of thinking about it in the context of larger systems that we're all a part of.
It's true. It's true. Okay, well, let's talk about the brain, this incredible organ that we all have. Because the documentary gets into some pretty fascinating neuro, specifically this idea that, like, get this, our brains actually start making decisions before we're consciously aware of making them. Apparently, like, studies have shown brain activity in those decision-making areas of the brain up to 10 seconds before someone actually says they've made a choice.
Yeah.
10 seconds. That's a pretty big gap.
Yeah, it is. And what I think is really cool about this is how it shows us that there are these two main ways our brain makes decisions.
Right.
So there's like this fast system that's automatic and kind of driven by emotions. It's the one that relies on, you know, habits and gut reaction. But then there's this other system that's slower, more analytical. And that one, it actually takes effort. And the transcript, it points out that a lot of our everyday choices, they come from that faster automatic system. So it's like we're kind of on autopilot a lot more than we realize. Like, you know, you instinctively reach for your phone when you're bored. You don't sit there and weigh the pros and cons, right?
Right, exactly. And that autopilot is kind of powered by, you know, these things called neural pathways, right? Like habits that we've repeated so many times that our brain is just like, okay, this is what we do.
Yeah.
Which I guess explains why breaking habits is so hard. And like we're literally trying to, you know, make new pathways in our brain. I was thinking of it like, imagine trying to make a new shortcut through a park that you always go to, that old path. It's just so much easier to follow, you know, at least at first.
Right. Right. And it makes sense, you know, that like marketing people, they understand this stuff. So they design these campaigns to like bypass our logic and really target those automatic brain processes, like those habits we were talking about, and emotional triggers.
And it's not just habits, is it? Because the documentary also talks about like brain chemicals like dopamine and how it can really influence us. It kind of makes us want to repeat certain behaviors. So things like, you know, social media notification or the thrill you get from gambling or even like how good certain foods taste. The transcript is saying these are all designed in a way to trigger that release of dopamine, which then makes us want more. So it's almost like we're being like subtly guided by these chemical rewards.
Totally. And if we bring it back to like the bigger picture, our environment, it plays a huge role in shaping our brain pattern right from the start. Like everything we see and hear and experience from when we're born, it creates this like basic framework for how we see the world, how we interact with it, and then ultimately how we make decisions. So often by the time we're actually like thinking about our choices, these patterns are already there really deep down.
Wow, that's fascinating. What about stress? Because I feel like stress definitely impacts, you know, our decisions.
Oh, for sure. The transcript mentions this. Stress kind of shifts our brain activity towards that faster, more emotional system, the one that relies on instinct and habit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it makes us more impulsive, less likely to really think things through. I mean, we've all been there, right? Making bad decisions when we're under pressure.
We have. So, like, is there anything we could do about all this? Like, I know we can't just, you know, rewire our brains completely, but is there anything we can do to be a little less on autopilot?
Well, you know, the documentary, it suggests that even just being aware of these processes can make a big difference. Like we can learn to just pause for a sec, take a breath, and then like engage that slower, more thoughtful system, especially when it's a big decision, you know? And also like when we're rested and well fed and not totally stressed out, it's kind of like creating this buffer between that initial impulse and then our actions.
Right. That pause, it can really help.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk about those early years, those really formative years, like from birth to, you know, around 7 years old. The documentary describes young brains during this time as being like like sponges, basically, just soaking up everything around them without really filtering anything. And this is when that like foundational code gets written, those core beliefs about ourselves and the world.
And what I think is so important is this idea that it doesn't really matter if those early messages are positive or negative, whether it's coming from parents, teachers, or even just, like stuff on TV. It all becomes a belief just through repetition. Like the young brain, it's not judging those input, it's just taking them in as truth.
So like if a child keeps hearing, you're capable, you can do it, that's going to have a different effect than if they keep hearing, like, you always make mistakes.
Yeah.
It really shapes how they see themselves,
Yeah.
And the documentary, they even point out that things like commercials, they can make kids want stuff, material possessions. And then even early exposure to violence, even if it's in cartoons, it can kind of normalize conflict.
And this is where it gets a little bit kind of controversial. The documentary talks about these things called control systems.
Yeah.
Now, they don't really give specific examples in this transcript, but the idea is that there are forces in society that might be like intentionally or unintentionally, influencing kids, like through the media or education or even just like how parents are told to raise their kids. And this could potentially lead to like adults who are more easily controlled or more compliant.
Right. And the documentary does suggest that like institutions like schools, although obviously they're important, they can also program us to be more compliant. Like think about how much emphasis there is on, following rules.
Yeah.
And sticking to schedules, getting good grades, all that stuff. It definitely shapes how we see authority figures later in life.
And then you've got social media, which has become such a huge influence, especially for young people. Like they're constantly seeing these, carefully curated images and messages, and it shapes how they see success and beauty and happiness and all that chasing after likes and followers. The documentary frames it as this like programmed need almost.
So like, is there any hope? Like, can we actually change any of this, if we were exposed to certain things early on?
Well, the good news is our brains are really good at adapting. They're plastic. So those early programs, they're not set in stone. We can definitely change them. But first, we've got to be aware of them, It's about noticing those automatic thought patterns, questioning those beliefs that have been there for a long time. Like, is this belief actually helping me? Or is it just like an old program running in the background?
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we identify those like deeply ingrained programs? Like, where do we even start?
Well, the transcript says pay attention to that voice in your head, that self-talk, If that inner voice is using like the same phrases or the same tone as authority figures from your childhood, that's a pretty good sign. And another thing to look at is your trigger. Like, what are those situations that really set you off? Those strong automatic reactions, they can often point back to, early programming.
Right. Good. Makes sense. What about for parents who are listening? Like, is there anything they can do given, how much programming kids are exposed to these days?
Yeah, the documentary, it really emphasizes that, kids today, they're facing even more programming than we did because of all the screens and the targeted content. So it's really important for parents to actively manage their kids' screen time. Encourage them to do stuff in the real world and also to help them develop critical thinking skills.
So important. So important. It really all comes back to awareness, doesn't it? Like you have to be aware of that software that's running in the background before you can start to change it.
Yeah, definitely. If you're not aware of it, it's just going to keep running,
It is. Okay, let's talk about language because the documentary, they really stress how the words we use and the words we hear, they actually shape our thought. And then that shapes our action, Like think about those jingles from commercials or those phrases your family always said. They stick with you.
It's true. It's like when those phrases or those patterns of speaking are repeated over and over again, it actually creates and strengthens pathways in our brain. And the media, they know this, right? So they do it all the time. Like how many times have we heard in these unprecedented times or for your safety and security? They repeat it so much, it becomes like the normal way of thinking, and it can subtly influence how we see things.
And it starts so young, doesn't it? Like from the time where kids were absorbing these frameworks for understanding the world through the language we hear. So like if you constantly hear warnings and rules, you might start to see the world as, a dangerous place.
Yeah. And then social media, it's a whole other level.
Right.
Because you've got all these short phrases that are easy to share that get repeated all the time, like memes and catchphrases. And they might seem harmless, but the transcript is saying that they often carry these like subtle messages, and it can influence how people behave, even, contribute to those divisions you see online between different groups.
Wow. I never really thought about it. And the documentary documentary, it goes even further. It says that if you control the words people have available, you can actually limit what they're able to think. Like if certain concepts aren't talked about or if there are no words to express them, then it's harder for people to even think about those things.
Right. Think about like politics or corporate jargon. They use words like freedom and security, team player, corporate culture, but they use them in these really specific ways. And it's like they're trying to program people to behave in a certain way. And sometimes it can like discourage people from thinking critically, you know?
Right. And it's not just formal language either, right? Like even just how we talk to each other casually, small talk, being polite, even relying on like common sense. All of that can kind of reinforce existing programming.
Yeah.
Because it keeps us within certain boundaries.
And the documentary, it's saying that we should be aware of these patterns, you know? Like, why do certain words feel so familiar? And why do others feel so weird? And what are those concepts that we don't even have words for? It's about, like, creating new ways of speaking so we can express those hidden truths and challenge that program.
It's almost like we need to be more conscious of the language we're using and the language we're hearing. Like, really pay attention to the word. Whether it's, you know, someone trying to sell us something or a politician giving a speech or even just, you know, how we greet each other. And the transcript even mentions that. Like, if you look at how slang changes, how common phrases evolve, it can tell you something about how our minds are being directed.
Yeah, it is. And it goes even deeper than that, like the structure of language itself, grammar, word order, punctuation, all of that can subtly guide our thought. And then you've got technology, things like autocomplete and spell check and even translation apps. They're shaping how we express ourselves too. And maybe even like limiting the diversity of our language.
Yeah. I guess if everyone's relying on the same tools, everyone's going to start to sound the same, right?
Right, exactly.
Well, this next area is fascinating and maybe a little bit less obvious. The documentary introduces this idea that we're being influenced by things that we can't even see or hear. It's like this invisible world of electromagnetic and sound frequencies.
Yeah, and the idea is that these frequencies can actually interact with our bodies and minds, even if you don't realize. The transcript, it talks about brainwave frequency, you know, like delta, theta, alpha, beta. They're all associated with different mental states. And the idea is that external frequencies could mess with those natural patterns. Like, you know, if you think about it, beta waves are dominant when you're awake and alert, but delta waves, they're dominant during deep sleep. So the thought is that external frequencies could make it harder for our brain waves to like do their thing, you know, stay in their natural rhythm.
Wow. Okay, so like what kind of frequencies are we talking about here? Like in our everyday lives?
Well, think about all the electronics we use, our phones, Wi-Fi, smart meters. They're all emitting electromagnetic frequencies. Right. And I know we're always told they're safe, but the documentary, it brings up research that's suggesting that maybe there is a link between, you know, these frequencies and things like sleep problems, anxiety, even our decision making.
Right. And it's not like we could just avoid them, right? I mean, they're everywhere.
Exactly. And think about it. We're exposed to way more radiation now than people were like 100 years ago. So the documentary is asking, you know, what are the long-term effects of all this? It's a good question.
It is. It is. And it's not just electromagnetic frequencies, right? Because the documentary also talks about these low-frequency sounds, specifically infrasound. It's like too low for us to hear, but it can still affect us, you know, like make us feel certain emotions, usually negative ones. I didn't know this, but apparently infrasound has been used for crowd control and even like in places like shopping malls to subtly influence shoppers without them knowing.
Kind of creepy, right? And the transcript also talks about how these different types of frequencies can interact, like the frequencies you find in TV broadcasts or even, you know, those signals from cell towers. And with 5G coming out, there are all these new higher frequency bands being like millimeter waves and you know, they're short-range signals, and they behave really differently from the lower frequency. So there are a lot of questions about what those long-term effects are. Like, how do they interact with the human body? Some research even suggests they interact with sweat glands.
It's a lot to think about. What about, like, music? Because we all listen to music. Is there anything in the documentary about that?
Yeah, they talk about how music and entertainment are often engineered with specific frequencies to make us feel certain emotions or even, like, alter our consciousness. Like, they even talk about using infrasound in movie soundtracks to make people feel tense without them realizing why.
Really? That's wild. Okay, so if we're these electromagnetic systems and we're being bombarded with all these frequencies, like what can we do about it? Is there anything we can do to protect ourselves?
Well, the documentary suggests a few things, like grounding. Have you heard of grounding? It's like when you have direct contact with the earth, so walking barefoot on grass, stuff like that. And also just limiting our exposure to electronics when we can. And, spending more time in nature, it's really about recognizing that these frequencies are all around us and they can affect us, and then taking steps to, minimize any negative effects.
Right. Okay. So it's like we have to be aware of this whole other environment that we can't even see, but it's still impacting us.
Exactly. Exactly. The air around us, it's not just empty space,
Yeah.
It's full of frequencies. Some are natural and they're good for us. Others are artificial and we don't really know what they're doing. And some might even be intentionally trying to influence us.
Okay, well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about this concept of social programming, because the documentary really paints a picture of this huge web of forces that are shaping how we think and behave from the moment we're born.
And what's really interesting is how much of this programming, it just becomes so normal to us. We don't even realize it's happening. The transcript uses this example, money. Paper money, it's not actually worth anything in itself, right? But because everyone agrees that it has value, we let it control so much of our lives.
Right. It's a shared illusion almost. What about things like education? Because I know the documentary talks about that.
Yeah, they suggest that education systems, they're not just about teaching us facts and skills, they're also teaching us to obey authority, to follow schedules, to compete with each other, and all of that shapes how we act as adults.
And then there's the media, which obviously plays a huge role in how we see the world, what news stories they choose to show us, how they present those stories. It all influences what we think is important, what we believe is true.
And then, of course, there's advertising, which the documentary points out isn't just about letting us know about product. It's about creating needs that we didn't even know we had, linking happiness to, buying stuff, making us feel like we need to consume.
Right. It's like they're creating this desire, this need for more.
Yeah. And then social media with those, likes and shares and follower counts. It's all designed to make us want that validation and to share things that will get attention, even if they're not true. And those algorithms, they're constantly collecting data about us so they can predict our behavior and influence us.
It's kind of scary when you think about it. They know us better than we know ourselves, almost.
Almost, yeah.
Okay, so we've got education, media, advertising. What about things like fashion or, celebrity culture? Because I feel like those things also influence us.
Oh, absolutely. The transcript talks about how fashion can kind of program group behavior, we all want to fit in, so we follow trends. And that makes us predictable consumers. And then celebrities, they're like these aspirational figures. We're constantly bombarded with images of their lifestyles and their products, and it makes us want those things.
It does. What about more traditional institutions like religion or, our work culture?
Yeah, they're part of this too. Religion, it instills these beliefs about morality and purpose and reality. And our work culture with those long hours and the dress codes and all that, it programs us to accept authority and to trade our time for money.
It's true. And then you've got all the political division, right? Everyone's fighting left versus right. Does the documentary say anything about that?
Yeah, they suggest that all that arguing, it can actually distract us from seeing these bigger patterns. We're so focused on fighting each other, we don't realize that we're all being influenced by the same system.
Makes you think. What about fear? Because I feel like fear is a big motivator, right?
Definitely. The documentary points out that fear is a really powerful tool for control. And the media, they use it all the time. Constant news about crime and terrorism and disease makes us feel anxious and insecure. And then we're more likely to give up our freedoms and look to authority figures for safety.
Right. And then there's debt,
which,
keeps people trapped in the system. And then there's just social pressure in general, which I guess makes people conform. Nobody wants to be the odd one out.
It's true. And all these things, they work together. It's like this interconnected system where everything reinforces everything else. So the documentary, it's saying that the first step is just recognizing these patterns.
Okay. Well, let's talk about entertainment, because the documentary, it calls it the entertainment mate. And it's basically saying that the entertainment industry in all its form plays a huge role in shaping our thoughts and our beliefs and our behaviors.
And what's really interesting is that a lot of this content, it's designed to influence us. TV shows, they often present certain lifestyles, normal and desirable, the characters we like, situations they're in, even the solutions they find. It can all shape how we see the world.
Right. And then movies, they can evoke really strong emotion. And those emotions, they can create these connections in our mind that then influence how we react in real life.
It's social media. We talked about this before, but, those algorithms, they're always filtering what we see, and it keeps us in these little bubbles where we're only exposed to things that confirm our existing beliefs.
Right. It's like those personalized echo chambers. What about video games? Because those are huge now.
Yeah, the transcript talks about how video games, they immerse us in these worlds with their own rules and rewards, and we can get really good at playing by those rules, but then it's like we internalize those rules, and we might start to expect the real world to work the same way, which it doesn't.
That's interesting. And then there's music, right? Which, it just bypasses our logic sometimes.
Yeah.
You hear a song, you feel the emotion, you don't even think about the lyrics.
Yeah, and then you've got news entertainment, which is this weird mix of facts and drama and opinions, and it can be hard to tell what's real anymore. It can make us believe things that aren't true.
Okay. So he's got TV, movies, social media, video games, music, news. What else is there?
Well, the transcript also talks about celebrity culture, how it distracts us from important issues, and how product placement, it's not just advertising, it's selling a whole lifestyle. And then there's reality TV, which is normalizing things like constant surveillance and judging people.
Yeah. Reality TV is a whole other thing, isn't it? What about stuff for kids? Because I know that's especially influential.
Yeah, the documentary talks about how children's entertainment, it can have a big impact on how they develop, what they learn about authority figures, what they think success means, how they're supposed to behave. It can really shape them. True. It's true. Okay, so we've got all this entertainment surrounding us all the time, and it's programming us in all these ways. So what can we do about it?
Well, the first step is awareness, right? Just realizing that this entertainment matrix exists, and then being more mindful about what we choose to consume.
Right. It's about choosing wisely, not just, mindlessly consuming whatever's put in front of us.
Exactly. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, all these different layers of control and influence. So what's the first step towards getting some of our mental freedom back? The documentary is really clear about this. It's awareness. But it's not just understanding these ideas in your head. It's deeper than that.
Right. So what does real awareness look like? Can you give us an example? Well, it's about paying attention to your daily routine and noticing how your attention is always being pulled in different directions, by notifications, news headlines, those ads that seem to know exactly what you're thinking, that endless stream of content on social media. It's all designed to keep you hooked,
Oh, yeah. And social media, it's it plays on our fear of missing out. We have to constantly be checking it. What if something's happened and we don't know about it? It's crazy. And the documentary is saying that all this checking, it's actually changing our brains. We're getting wired to need that constant stream of information.
Yeah.